Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fourth and final session of this Public History Conference sponsored by the University of Lethbridge and the Public Library. Where shall I begin on things that have to be announced? Can't hear me back there? I don't know if this is working. I guess it doesn't pick up from very far away. The conference is being videotaped by CATV, and tapes will be made available on VHS, I've been notified, of the conference, and can be obtained for any of the sessions at $20 a session? Is it correct amount? Okay. That means you can get a tape of Andy Notter's talk on Thursday evening, Alex Johnston's talk last evening, the slide presentation this morning, or this afternoon's panel discussion. I would also like to offer a few advertisements, if I may. One is the publication of the official history of Lethbridge by Andy Notter and Alex Johnston, which will be coming out in April. And there are order forms up here, as a matter of fact, for that. Or, if you feel especially flush today, a $100 leather-bound delivered one. I should also say that the Whoop-Up chapter of the Historical Society of Alberta has its annual meeting next month, and I would like to encourage any of you who are not members of that society to consider joining it. Now, this afternoon, we are going to have a roundtable discussion, so to speak. We hope that people in the audience will participate in this as well, on various themes of the city's past. And at our front table today, we have with us Margaret Wheeler, who was born in Lethbridge, although she spent most of her years in the East, and was the librarian at the community college, and has achieved fame recently with an index of the McLeod Gazette and the early Lethbridge News, and is now doing a follow-up volume indexing the Lethbridge News, Lethbridge Herald.
Yes.
Right. To her right is Joan Waterfield, who's probably known to all of you, who is renowned for her work in the arts and for her columns, as I was reminded this noon, actually, and came to Lethbridge in the 1940s, I believe, and has seen Lethbridge grow through its, I suppose, its biggest boom period. To my right, I'm blocking Mr. Carpenter off. To my right is Jim Carpenter, who was the chief of police in Lethbridge and has been an active member, a long active member in the Whoop-Up chapter of the Historical Society, and of course has produced a book called Badge and Blotter on police history in Lethbridge. To Joan's right is Bruce Haig, who was a school teacher in Lethbridge and is the founder, impetus behind Historic Trails West. Bruce has been active in a number of different activities to promote history. And I don't know, is your award public?
I guess so. It's in one of these.
He's about to receive the Heritage Service Award from the province of Alberta. This is one award that's given annually, the Heritage Service Award by the Alberta Historical Resources Foundation. Next to Bruce is Alex Johnston, who we probably all know as well, president of the Whoop-Up chapter of the Historical Society, long active in history, collecting the history of Lethbridge and writing it. You should also know who is next to him, Bill Baker. Bill Baker and I have really done the organization of this conference on behalf of the university, and we are up here primarily, I guess, to be able to get our question in fact. Do what?
Breakup fights.
To break up fights, okay. Oh, I hope it comes to that. That might be a nice climax to the whole thing. We asked everybody if they would like to begin with a brief statement about some aspect of the past, either something from their own experience or from the work that they do or the avocation that they pursued in relationship to the history of the city. And we didn't discuss this beforehand, but if I can just start to my right, if we can just go around, I think that there is no particular order that needs to be followed. So I'll give you Jim Carpenter first.
Well, I think I'll be like Bill and stand on my feet to talk. Can everybody hear me? My mother and father came here in 1920. They had considered leaving me in Cranbrook, but the police had already brought me home twice, so that seemed like a useless exercise, and I landed up in Lethbridge. What aspects of life does a 10-year-old boy find most impressionable? In my case, it wasn't Boy Scouts, it wasn't cars, and it wasn't girls. It was vacant lots. And in the 1920s, there was lots and lots of vacant lots across the city. The real estate bust had already taken place, and of course, this left playgrounds for the various groups and gangs about the city. The three I remember most was when we lived on the north side. There was a big vacant lot on 5th Avenue A. Then we moved to the south side on 3rd Avenue, and there was a great, huge vacant lot across the street. They built an arena on it, which burnt down, and then the Elks Club built on it, and the Boy Scouts. The next vacant lot I remember is the one on 6th Avenue A, and it was between 12th and 13th Street, and it was quite a large vacant lot. And it was here that we played baseball and scrub and soccer and peggy and marbles and all the rest of it. In the wintertime, the city would come along and scrape a level space off, flood it. We would play hockey and do our skating here. That's one of the impressions I have. The next one is the bathing crowds out on the shores of Henderson Lake. There's a large raft anchored out in the lake and a large water slide. They were approximately where the Japanese pavilion is today. Not only did we swim in Henderson Lake, but there was bathing picnics on St. Mary's River and on the Old Man River. In fact, summer didn't officially start until you got the itch from Henderson Lake. Another impression was sitting on a fence just about where the pool is in the Civic Center and watching the Mounted Police Cavalry. Behind me would be the stables, capable of holding about 100 horses. There were about 120 men attached to K Division at that time, stationed in Lethbridge. Their equipment, when they went out on the field, was polished to the nth degree. And if you've ever lived in the barracks of the Mounted Police, you'll know that about half their time was spent polishing their equipment. Their lances with the steel points just glistened in the sunlight. And this was the thing that I was most impressed with, was the lance drill. The Mounted Police would get up to one end of the field, and then they would gallop at full gallop down to the other end of the field, lower their lances. There would be a small 2x4 peg driven in the ground. They'd pick that up and then ride back, take their place in the line again. Now, why they practice this lance drill, I don't know, because I can't recall of any time in Canadian history where the Mounted Police used the lance as a weapon. Another impression is the streetcars. We didn't ride them very much in the summertime, but in the wintertime, especially on the north side, when that's the blue line, I didn't ride too much on the white line on the south side or the red line going out to Henderson Lake. But I can recall in the wintertime the wet smell of the tweed and the woolen overcoats and garments, together with the coal coming from the little heater in the front of the cab. The little heater didn't do much to heat the streetcar, but it sure smelled like it did. And then there was Saturdays. Saturdays years ago was Farmer's Day. And it was also matinee day for the kids. And when there was a Tom Mix matinee on, the kids would be down there bright and early in the morning, sometime before 8 o'clock. And they would be lined up in front of the theater for blocks, 10 kids deep. And quite often you'd have to wait till they finished the show once, and then they'd let the rest of the group in for a second showing. And Saturday too was the Saturday night crowds. You don't see these anymore downtown. It was like a great, huge security blanket. You'd get into this crowd and you'd be swept along the streets, and of course you knew everybody. Lethbridge, between 1920 and 1940, kind of stagnated. The people living there kind of became permanent, and you got to know everybody. So when you went downtown on a Saturday night, well, you pretty near knew everybody in the crowd. If you didn't know their name, you knew where they worked. Even as a policeman, when I joined in 1940, part of my duties was to go along the streets and keep saying, now move along, don't block the store windows. I can remember saying that and then I get back to the station and some merchant would phone up, say there's a crowd in front of my store window and nobody can see my display. Professor Tagg asked me to mention something about Lethbridge that I found unique. I could say the obvious and say it's the wide streets and the clean streets. But I think I'll go back and draw on my police experience again. Lethbridge was unique because it was a wide open city from its inception and for the next half century. And yet, it was a pleasant place to live. It was well policed. It was a safe place to walk, a safe place to bring up your kids, and crime was below the national average. Sure, we had bawdy houses. The Criminal Code of Canada outlawed them, but they were allowed to flourish in Lethbridge, first on the Point, and later west of the main business district, along 3rd Avenue and 3rd Street South. And we had bootleggers too, lots of them. Even though the Liquor Act was very, very strict, liquor was easily obtainable. The fines were high for the time, $300 in costs. If you had an open bottle, it cost you 25 bucks. And yet, there was all kinds of people went into the bootlegging business. I should mention too that during the war, I would say the bootleggers numbered in the thousands, because people that really didn't buy liquor often went to the liquor vendors and bought a bottle for their neighbor, because you were only allowed one bottle a month. And some of the drinkers got pretty dry. Gambling was also allowed to flourish. The Criminal Code of Canada was very specific in this regard. Any type of gaming with a rake-off was illegal. But we had so many single men in the community that it didn't matter what the government said, they were going to gamble all night and all day anyway. I should go back to the bawdy houses. They were first in tents in the river bottom. And not physically. And then later into the business district. The Point is that coulee north of the Sir Alexander Galt Museum, where the parking lot of the Lodge Hotel is. And it was the old mine houses there that the ladies of the night, as they called them, set up business. And then when we put the sewers in, I guess they moved into closer to the business area, into the houses there. If you were to stand on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 4th Street go west, then on your right would be Emma's chili parlor. Next to her place was McBride's, and then Claudette's, and then Carrie's or Minnie's.
Oh, I love this.
And then kitty corner across the road was Eva's place. Straight west.
It's great. Go on, Jim.
Straight west was Louise Wilson's. Then next to the alley was Mildred's place and Vivette's. And then there was a great huge root cellar. And then Ada's place. Some of you will remember Ada's place because Julia Fisher took it over later and turned it into a rooming house. And of course across the street from that was Irene's. And interspersed all through here were the odd bootlegging place.
Jim, you forgot Minnie White.
No, I didn't. I mentioned it.
When did Molly Bullcalf come in, Jim? That's the one I remember. I presume Irene's, that's where it started. Good night,
Yeah.
Irene.
The one thing about the houses of prostitution was that there was no pimps in Lethbridge, nor was there any gangster goons that could control the whole thing. They were controlled by the police, and that was it. The bootleggers were much the same way. Right offhand, I would say there was about 100 regulars or more or less. And they operated, some of them near the business district, some of them in North Lethbridge, some of them out on the 5-acre plots. The taxis were all mixed up in the liquor business. The bawdy houses were all mixed up in the liquor business. And even this type of business, and it was a lucrative business because some of the people, was their living. And those that didn't make their living at it certainly augmented their weekly wage by it. And still, they had no fear of the mafia-type mobster or anything. The only fear they had was the fear of the law itself. Gamblers, they were scattered mainly on the south side. Sometimes they'd be in posh quarters like the Chinook Club. This club, incidentally, got its first charter under the old Northwest Territories Act. And under that act, as well as under the Liquor Act, if you had a certain type of club, you were allowed to take a 15% rake off. And you were also allowed to sell liquor. I found this out the hard way. I raided it one night, and I had to pack everything back in again the next day. The gambling mainly with the single men was, say, in the basement of the Zarko block, up in one of the rooms in the Began block, behind Greggy's barber shop, places of this nature, in the old Victoria Cafe, and all this. Now, this was the gambling that the white men did. And on top of this, we had the Chinese gambling. This was more or less limited to Chinatown, and mostly it was Mahjong, Fantan, some Dofar, some Pai Gao. And then again, for the third instance, there was the lottery, the Chinese lottery. You think of the 649, the Chinese lottery was much the same, except that it was a 1080. In other words, there was 80 numbers on the card, and there was 10 numbers picked. And if you drew a 6 spot, you got so much money. If you drew a 7 spot, you got quite a bit more. An 8 spot, quite a bit more. A 9 spot, if it was a, say, a 25-cent bet, and the company only had $500, well, you got the whole 500. And of course, a 10 spot, why, you broke the company. There were attempts to take over organized gambling in this town while I was chief. They never succeeded. If I recall correctly, I think there was another attempt made in '79 and also did not succeed, and they were prosecuted. Yes, Lethbridge, from my point of view, did have a unique and colorful past. And as we move into the 2nd century, it seems rather ironic that the new austere courthouse should dominate the area where once the red lights glowed.
No further introduction. I'm sorry, Margaret, that you have to follow that.
That's a hard act to follow, there's no doubt about that. I think first of all I should start by giving you a little bit more about the index. Insofar as the way it was presented on the flyer, it indicates that I was responsible. I was only co-responsible. Barb Marshalsea, many of you would know Barbara, particularly the fact that she's Robert Niven's daughter. Barb and I did this together, and in doing so, we got really thoroughly intrigued by the past. And since I'm carrying on with this, I'm even more intrigued. When I was asked to come here today, I had a hard time deciding, should I tell reminiscences? Should I pick up a real theme? What? Anyway, I decided perhaps I could say something about what made our society. And in doing that, you'd go back to the beginning, and Lethbridge was by and large started by Scots. They really were, in the main, the first people here. Whether they came straight from Scotland or from the miners from eastern Canada, Nova Scotia primarily, the Gaspé, I presume, they set the standard. Well, if you say Scottish, 9 times out of 10, you are referring to Knox Presbyterians. And any of you who know anything about Knox Presbyterianism know that it is a fairly rigid, moralistic society. Add to the fact they were also Victorians. So there you have a mindset, I choose to call it, a somewhat strict morality, but since they were Victorians, they were also somewhat hypocrites, inasmuch as they seemed to be and intended to be, but as Jim points out, there were other things that they somehow managed to overlook. However, they were joined by, needless to say, others, but they were all, in the first days, WASPs. Well, you get Presbyterian morality and you get Methodist morality. You join that with the Baptists who then came in. You have what I would say a fairly puritanical society. By the time we had the influx of ethnic groups, other races, the WASPs were in full charge. They were our establishment, and it was that establishment that set the tone for the Lethbridge that I know or remember. What we have to admit, though, is that these men were very energetic, very hardworking, quite far-sighted, and they definitely saw a future for themselves here, and they were most optimistic about what could and couldn't be done. So that set the moral tone, which also led to sort of the discrimination that came in. And if you really trace this through, this still remains in many aspects. We still have our ideas of morality, one being the fuss we're still making over Sunday observance, which was done in the 1880s, 1890s. Big deal about closing the post office on Sunday. This, they didn't even go so far as to worry about the stores, but it was something like the post office that bothered them on the Sabbath. But you have to, as I say, give them credit for being what they were and really seeing the future. And planning. They were great on planning. Big ideas, very optimistic. They were quite sure they could do it. Now, most of these people came from fairly working class or middle class background, so they had the opportunity to move up into what they considered society in the terms of Victorian and later Edwardian, with the net result that we had quite a social scene here. They were very strong on education, fortunately, and on culture. Right from the beginning, practically, we had a club of every single kind. Drama, debating, literary societies, historical society, men's clubs, women's clubs. I doubt if there's anything that was overlooked in terms of forming an association. Debating societies, mock parliaments, I really can't think of anything that was missed. As a child, I took it all for granted. As an adult, now, looking back, particularly after having read the sweep of history through our papers, and our papers were really, in their own way, very prejudiced, but they're fascinating reading because the prejudices come through loud and clear. Looking back on it now, I have a completely different sort of picture insofar as I'm rather putting it together in my own mind. Now, I could probably get arguments on a lot of the things in which I believe, but this is the synthesis of what I've got from it all. And before I stop, I also want to give credit to the women. Victorian age, the women knew their place, granted, but they worked just as hard as the men. You will find a ladies' aid in practically every area. Galt Hospital certainly deserves, at least should, give a great deal of credit to the women of the ladies' aid. Every church had a ladies' aid. And then when the fraternal and benevolent societies became important here, they also had their, not ladies' aids, but the ladies of the society. I really don't want to go on. I'd rather sit down now and listen to the others. Now, I'm sorry I can't cope with Jim, or can't match Jim, which was a really interesting and fun presentation. But anyway, this was the one thing I wanted to leave with you, the roots of what we still are. Thanks.
My turn?
I assume we will move to a little more modern subject than roots, or not?
Oh, I shouldn't think so. I suppose I'm of an age when I can get into my anecdotage also. And since I've been here since 1945, I've piled up a fair amount of years in Lethbridge. No, I can't match Jim's lovely. I don't think the courthouse is any improvement, Jim. I think the original purpose was much more satisfactory. And Jim has referred to a certain state of stasis that existed into the 40s. Margaret has referred to the founding fathers as being Scots. Well, since I came in the 40s and I'm Scotch, I guess you could call me the second coming. What I came to, of course, was surprising in the least. I came from a large urban centre in Scotland, Aberdeen. I came out here as a war bride into the unknown. I came from the sea to the prairie. And, well, let's put it this way, it was a bit of a shock. I started off on 12th Street North, and I can give you the address now, 626 12th Street North. 626 does not exist as it did then. I guess they didn't want to preserve my first home as an historical site. There is a duplex now occupying that lot. But it was a two-roomed little house. And I went into it, and of course my first question, it's like the Bloody Mary at Calais engraved on her heart. This is forever engraved on mine. But where's the bathroom, darling? And my husband made a great gesture and pointed, let me see, into the west. And that was my first confrontation with outdoor sanitation, and I can tell you right now, it damn near killed me. Because as most war brides did, we leapt into bed and immediately became pregnant. And if you can imagine being pregnant in that little house on the north side with its outside toilet, it wasn't fun. There was no insulation. And for the first time, we confronted, you know, coming from a moderate climb, we confronted temperatures that went up over the 90s for days. We encountered mosquitoes. I know, I had my personal flock. They came sailing over out of the mountains. I'm sure they picked up a few black fly on the way. They looked down and said, oh, there's a lovely bit of Scotch beef. And they ate me. We had winters where the temperatures plummeted to 30, 40 below. The bedclothes, and I'm sure many of my age group can remember these conditions. You didn't push your bed against the wall. The natural warmth of bodies created a circumstance that the bedclothes froze to the wall, and so you had to pull them away. Oh, you remember that, do you? We also had, I found the ice box. I'll never forget the ice box, because I was one of those women who could never remember to empty that damn pan that caught all the drippings underneath. But I must admit, the ice pick was very, very handy in the wintry days, because the front door wouldn't open, and you took the ice pick and you chipped it, and you got out. I'm very interested about the Fille de Joie that Jim has talked about, because I also remember the streetcars coming down 13th Street North, and with their cane-bottomed seats, and you used to come right down 13th Street and then make a loop downtown, and they were really a wonderful form of transportation. They always ran. It didn't matter how hot or how cold the weather, you could count, right, Jane, on a streetcar. But it was their mode of embarking on this. Now, I came from this large urban centre, and if there wasn't a bus going this way, there was a tram going this way, and one stood up at regulation stops, and with the British facility to queue, you were very orderly about it. So my first sojourn downtown, I asked my husband, well, where do I get this streetcar? It sounded, I'm sorry, but it sounded, Jim, so American. You know, a streetcar. It was like handbags that became purses, but howsoever. And he said, well, you just go up to 13th Street North and you stand on the corner. I said, which corner? He said, any corner, just stand on the corner. And I said, well, do I put my hand out? He says, no, you just stand on the corner. Well, Jim, you and I know that a lady does not stand on the corner, because you never know what will drive up, right? Howsoever, I found indeed one just stood on the corner with an expectant look on your face, and the streetcar clanged up and stopped. There were so many differences for war brides, etc. I come from a background nourished by parents who, even in depression, had their priorities right, that there was always a wee penny for books, a penny to go to the show, and I loved those Saturday matinees, smelly though they were. There was something for the theatre. I could go for sixpence up to the gods in His Majesty's Theatre in Aberdeen and see an Olivier, a Gielgud, an Yvonne Arnaud, a Deborah Carr. I was used to going to the Symphony Hall and seeing Sir Malcolm Sargent conducting the LSO, or John Barbaroli conducting the Halley. I was used to galleries. In fact, where my high school was in Aberdeen, there was my high school, and there was the boys' school, which didn't hurt at all. And there was the art gallery, where I swear I found out about sex. I'd never seen the undraped male figure, but that was where we used to go and eat our tuck shop pies and look at these beautiful, gorgeous statues. And that was interesting too. And then next to it was the museum, and then next to that was the theatre, and next to that was the Symphony Hall. And then I come to Lethbridge, to my two-room shack, the outhouse. And I guess I'm a continuum of something that this, and I will say quite frankly that this city should be pretty happy about. Because I was one of these people who came out with some background, some things that we wanted, we desired, we had lived with, and I wanted it here as well. The great good fortune of coming to a place like Lethbridge was to find a history, a cultural history, that was long, exciting, and well-rooted. And of course, I became one of the biggest defenders, because when the university opened, no insult intended, Jim and Bill, but we got a raft of university professors who came like messiahs, who were going to bring culture to this city. And I had the delightful job of disabusing them that they were indeed original, that our culture had been exciting for many, many years. I was privy, this will interest you, Alec, I was privy to a scrapbook kept by Superintendent Biggins, wife. Now, we're talking turn of the century, right? And here was this marvelous scrapbook of all the wonderful shows that came to Lethbridge, all the great artists. And I was delighted the other day, there was a little blip of yours, Bruce, and it said Sir John Martin Harvey visited in 1926. And he appeared at the Majestic Theatre, one of the last of the great actor-managers. In Began's scrapbook, here was a family that went to New York every year. And they would go to the Metropolitan Opera, they would go to the theatre, and the one that delighted me was one program from the Great Palace Vaudeville House in New York. And in little print, right at the bottom, was a rather interesting act that was making its way, the Marx Brothers. I'm glad to think that the Marx Brothers finally did make the big time. But this was the exciting thing, the things that I found, that there was this great background. Now, where did this come from? Well, I think it came out of people very much like myself, from generations a few back, that wanted what they'd had. But there was also this spontaneous eruption that happens all the time in the most unlikely families, that you find the artist, you find the actor, you find the historian. There's nothing in their background that indicates, nothing from their milieu, their family milieu, that this is going to happen. I think Lethbridge has been rich in this type of thing. But there were many things that also delighted me. The social life of Lethbridge, and if you go back into the old Lethbridge News, etc., I was looking at a most wonderful description of the debut of a Miss Gladys Downer, who had been a student at Havergal, and she was launched at the Knights of Pythias Hall in full fig. The description of the gowns were superb, including a description of a gown worn by Mr. Thad Ives' mother, and she must have been a dazzler. It's a lovely piece. Mrs. Conybeare was magnificently dressed, and she wore a diamond clasp in her head, clutching these ospreys. There was a highly visible social life, and I think often people, when they talk about the West, they think of the great pioneer masses coming out to soddy huts. We seem to have arrived sort of beautifully shaped all together. When I arrived in Lethbridge, one thing did delight me in the Lethbridge Herald. I won't say it was the last thing that delighted me in the Lethbridge Herald, but it was one of the first things that delighted me in the Lethbridge Herald. There was a social column. Oh, do you remember the social column? Betty Bletcher, I think, was the sister of Miss Hazel Bletcher, in whose memory I think these fine facilities should be dedicated. And everything was reported. And I fell apart laughing. I mean, society, as far as I was concerned, was, well, probably the Countess of such and such and the darling Duke of so-and-so, and something that didn't touch my life. We were ordinary, probably middle-class, lower middle-class people. But here was a full-blown society column, and they were always having teas. And the teas were fully reported as to who served, of course wearing one of Miss Marie Louise's gorgeous hats, who presided at the silver tea service. Candles were never called candles. They were always pink tapers. My God, you must have cornered the market of pink tapers in this community. Who poured for the first hour? I always wondered who was the poor devil who got the second hour. But the only one reported was who poured for the first hour. And everything. Mrs. Schmutballs was visiting her daughter so-and-so and would be here for such and such. Mr. Claglehorn was departing to somewhere. And it seemed such a strange mix-up in a town which I think would have been between 18 and 20,000, that they had this wonderful social life. But there was another side. I guess I made the fellows laugh, but I was being a little serious too when I referred to Checkpoint Catelli. Now you're probably asking what the hell Checkpoint Catelli is. Well, I consider that was the line of demarcation. You know Catelli's place on 13th Street North. One thing I found which shocked me. There was a great demarcation line between the south of Lethbridge and the north of Lethbridge. There was a wrong side of the tracks mentality. There was prejudice. I had never heard the word bohunk. I never heard the surrounding things which afflicted everyone of Middle European ancestry. I even ran into some prejudice myself as a war bride. Don't you know that we were the gals that took your man? Well, I'm sorry about that, and you can have them back. I'm fed up with it. But I ran into this, and I lived on the north side, and I had some great experiences. At that time, living in this little house, I didn't have, I wasn't a call girl, honestly, but everybody called. In the morning, in came the baker, there was the iceman who cometh, there was the postman, the mailman, there was the bread man, and the milkman. I was married to the milkman. So he used to come in for his coffee at the same time as all these other fellows. And most of the vehicles, delivery vehicles, were indeed drawn by horse. And my husband's milk route was up what was known, and I'm going to make an ethnic slur, and you must forgive it because it was exactly as people said it when they were being at the most derogatory. It was up number 3. And that was how they say it. And I didn't know what number 3 was. Anyway, there came this time, they were wonderful people in number 3, as I will relate. There was a thing, anybody who delivered bread or milk, come the Christmas or New Year's, well, you knew what happened. It was, here comes the milkman, let's give him a drink. Here comes the bread man, you've got time for a drink. Well, the natural consequence was that milkmen and breadmen were found abandoned on their carts. But fortunately, every horse knew the way home to the barn. So you never had to worry. Howsoever, being young and in our prime, etc., as a protective measure, my husband took me on the milk wagon with him to deliver milk up number 3. So this was really the first time. We didn't have a car. I mean, we were poor. I'm talking poor. We had no car, nothing like that. But I did for the first time see number 3, and I met some of the women with whom my husband had, what word would I, not concourse, that's not the word, some, you know, that he met. Anyway, just to finish up, maybe on a note that says why I love this city, though I get awful fed up of it when I'm standing on cold corners waiting for buses and when that damn wind blows. When I had my first child, my first little girl, nobody gave a damn. My own parents were back in Scotland longing to see their own grandchild. But nobody seemed to care. And I was in hospital, very proud of myself that I'd given birth to this little girl in 1947. And the first step off the elevator at visiting time was always my husband's. And every day he came in with a bouquet of glads, or a little knitted jacket, or a pair of booties. And these gifts came from the woman on his milk route in number 3. Can you wonder that I love this city?
Well, Bruce, it gets harder all the time.
You know, when it came time to sit down here, we had to manipulate our positions, you see, where we're going to be, and look what I ended up with. Well, I'm going to jump around a bit, I think, here. First of all, you old folks here, you've got to realize that I'm another generation. And so I'm and a South Sider, right. Now, one thing I would like to say, I'm sure nobody's going to mention it, is that I think the real change and the real interesting era is right now. When the people look back 20 years from now and they see the things that have been brought about by the baby boomers, such as Jim here. I think he squeaks in as a baby boomer. You can always tell the baby boomers, you know, they're the guys that have the little bands around their head and they're running up and down the street. Now, you see, when I was a kid, old man would never have been running up and down the street, I'm sure. Wouldn't be riding a bicycle or anything
Yeah.
like that. Also, I think the influence of the computer will change everything in the next few years, but maybe even more than anything else, the women's movement. And we're right in the middle of the revolution now, so that in the next few years it's going to be a fantastic number of changes. And I think as an historical society, this is something we always have to think about. I can remember 15 years ago, Alec, one of your meetings, and they were talking about the history of Lethbridge, and they were talking about the Galts and the McGraths and all this thing. And I remember leaning over to George Watson or somebody and say, what about the prisoner of war camp? That's something I remember. And he gave me sort of a funny look. And to the people of that era, the prisoner of war camp wasn't history, I think. And the things that we do now, I have a hard time thinking of the University of Lethbridge as history. But I guess it really is. So it depends on what era we're in. Now, with this in mind, I'd like to point out, Jim, that I went to school with your daughter, so I'll take it from another generation if I could. And these are some of the things that I remember, and this way you're going to get two generation views. First of all, the empty lots. Right, I agree. They were a big thing. They were still around when I was a kid. And you always had to have a cave or a hut. You must have been into caves and huts too. Nowadays the kids don't seem to have these huts. I don't know where they are. Marbles. Never see anybody anymore playing marbles. I'd like to say something about Joan here. I remember when I was a little kid, I used to go to story time at the library. Do you remember that?
Well, I remember that.
And I only went once. And you know why?
I knew I was a hit.
No, because somebody threw up right in the middle of the story. Do you remember that?
I'm still getting that reaction.
And it just shows you how things will have a bad connotation, and I can still smell that library that one Saturday morning. Nothing about your story there. Games, kick the can, run sheep run, prisoners base. Where are they today? You never hear anything about those things. You probably had those in your day, didn't you, Jim? But how many kids do you know now that are out playing run sheep run? Never heard of it for years. Outdoor rinks. Nobody said anything about outdoor rinks, so I finally got the first one on that. Remember, you used to be able to go down to you didn't have to wait until you were assigned your time between 8 and 9 or 4 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock, as it is in Calgary, I guess. If it was nice, cold weather, you just went out and played hockey anytime you wanted. The toboggan hill. Nobody's mentioned the toboggan hill. You people a few years older, in the 20s, did you run down to the
Laundry Hill.
Well, the Great Toboggan Hill I remember is the one out behind is it the convent or whatever they call, just over, St. Martha, is it? There's a lovely hill right behind that. Remember, it had the big rock right at the top, and every Sunday was just full of people. And the Coolies, everybody played in the Coolies. I don't know if kids run down to the Coolies anymore. And the place where the sewer, I assume it was the storm sewer, used to enter the Coolies. That was a great place because you went down there and you could play commandos. See, I was the age where the war was on and everything was commandos and this type of stuff. And you could smoke your first cigarette there. Great place for that first cigarette. And Ron Batsford, some of you will remember him, he was telling me the other day, we were talking about the great days in the sewer, and he was saying, yes, I remember one day we opened the grate. I can still remember that grate, to get into the sewer. I didn't realize it opened, or I might have been there too. But he said they opened the sewer one day, and they walked all the way up to the 3rd Avenue in front of the public library. So they followed the sewers all the way through and came up just outside the public library. Must have been great fun, but I missed that one, thankfully. Leaflets during the war, when they used to, I remember one day they were bombarding us with leaflets out of planes. I don't remember what they said, but maybe some of you do. Greg, you probably know what it was. The mock air attacks. You remember going up the top of the McFarland building one night for a mock air attack. And this next one, it's been well covered, and that is the milk wagons. I won't touch that, but I always was amazed at how those milk wagons would just stop right place and then move on to the next place and so on. Amazing. I never thought they'd ever be replaced. I thought, how can you better that, you know? But they did. One thing I wanted to comment on. Did you notice when Jim Carpenter was doing his, you know, these massive notes that he had, and he kept reading all this stuff, but when he was talking about those body houses, he did not look at his
What a wonderful title for a book. You've got one line in here. Nights on the Point and Days in the Sewer.
Just a few more here. The North-South rivalry has already been covered. The chain gang, nobody mentioned the chain gang. Slingshots. Everybody had a slingshot in my day. I don't think you can carry them around anymore, because you never hear about them. Finding a prisoner of war uniform. Now here's something you see from my generation that probably never happened to you, because you were already raising families and so on. But I remember coming back from the Wolf Cubs, and whenever we left the Anglican church after Wolf Cubs, we always used to think it was great to sneak in and ring the church bell, which got supposedly everybody upset. At least we used to think that it got everybody upset. And we came back, came down 11th Street, just in that alley where the old Mormon church was that burned down. And on a Friday night, we found this old prisoner of war uniform, you know, the gray shirt with the big red dot on it. And of course, at that time, the prisoners were working in the mounted police barracks. And so this was quite a find. We contacted the police, and the police came over and interviewed us and all this kind of stuff. Now, for those old-timers that always are saying that young people don't know how to spell, okay? Let me tell you that we're having an LCI reunion. You may have heard of this in the middle of July. So we've been going through yearbooks looking for names. And I want you to know that the yearbooks that were published in the early 40s have the worst spelling I've ever seen in yearbooks ever. It's just amazing how they ever got away with the type of writing that was done in those early yearbooks. They wouldn't get away with it today. I think the teachers were all over fighting the war and they left their class or something, because it's just unbelievable. Alex Harper, aren't you here? You were probably in one. You maybe did some of that, did you? Weeded school grounds. You know, in the old days, they never had grass. I never thought they'd ever put grass in school grounds. It seems, you know, grass is for a little plot out in front of somebody's house, but nowadays they're all grassed in. Prairie sloughs, nobody's mentioned that. Down in the Duff edition, pointed out in a slide this morning, there was a great big slough right where Sears is today. There was another one out behind the Henderson Lake over by Adams. Maybe some of you know the name of that one, by the meat packing plant. And I think that's pretty well all. I'm going to pass it on now.